I am Sam Harris, housing economist and co-founder of SeeKing Change, an organization examining the homeless situation in the greater Seattle and King County region. Each week, we'll be exploring an issue at the heart of the problem to find the root causes of homelessness. At the end of the 12 weeks, we'll present a unified solution. Week 1, we explored the nature of sweeps with the COC co-chair Ruby Romero. I left that conversation feeling that the semblance of control we feel by removing people without providing housing is more than offset by the damage it creates to the people displaced. And then last week, we talked to Joe Malloy, focused on changing stigmas about autism, neurodivergence, and disability in the homelessness community. It would appear that the trauma of housing loss can exacerbate or trigger mental, physical, and emotional issues that make stabilizing even more challenging. And with that in mind, today we're going to talk to Joe Broome about the trauma of housing instability and how we can support stabilization for people who have experienced this trauma and reinvigorate hope. With us today, all right, Joe Broome, a licensed mental health counselor based in Renton, Washington, serving the greater King County area since 2008. With a focus on trauma, attachment, parenting, and ADHD, Joe brings a wealth of experience to his practice, drawing from his background as a former high school vocational teacher, foster parent, and step-parent. Recently, Joe has embarked on a journey to deepen his understanding of healing modalities by pursuing a certificate in psychedelic-assisted therapy from the California Institute of Integral Studies, combining his expertise in complex integration of multiple brain systems. That therapy, it's called CIMBS, with psychedelic-assisted therapy. Joe recently co-led a 2-day workshop for psychotherapists in the greater Pacific Northwest. Beyond his professional pursuits, Joe's intellectual curiosity lies at the nexus of culture, psychology, evolution, spirituality, justice, and the quest for wholeness. Thank you, Joe, for being here. And what led you to explore the psychedelic-assisted therapy?
Inadequate tools. You work with enough trauma and people, and you quickly realize that we need better tools. So I've been reading about psychedelics for many years, probably over 10 years, and kind of quietly learning about it, fascinated, intrigued, and then I finally basically took a sabbatical a couple of years ago. I think the pandemic and whatnot had me wanting to do a little internal reflection, and I said, I'm doing this. This is the next direction. So it's been a wild adventure. I've learned a lot about healing, and there's a whole other way of looking at this work. A lot of it's informed by indigenous people that have been doing this for 10,000 years, of these other healing modalities using these plant medicines. So it's got amazing potential and some potential huge challenges coming up as we roll this out in the near future.
Right. That actually leads me to my next question, which is, what are the dangers that are presented by using this type of therapy?
Well, anytime you have more powerful tools, right, you have more possibility for harm. And this is these are incredibly powerful tools. And,
I suppose the better question is, what does it take to make it successful?
What does it make to make it successful? Okay. Well, it takes a lot of training. We got to train up to 30,000 people, up to 30,000 therapists and providers for this. So that's underway now. People are getting trained. There needs to be many, many more. There's about 1,500, I think, trained so far. So we got a long ways to go, and we need to create accountability and structures and processes. We're like in the innovation stages here. We're trying to mix Western psychology with the psychedelic paradigm, and there's lots of innovation happening. Lots of people are going to be trying to figure out how to make this work, and that's right where we're at. I mean, it's not even legalized yet, except for ketamine at this point. So, yeah.
Yeah, I have this vision that we can utilize this type of therapy for some stage of the recovery process from people who have uh, been living without housing. One of the problems we run into is when you lose your housing, the trauma is so huge that it actually reduces life expectancy by 30 years.
That's
So
incredible.
I know it. So recovering from that, if you have any tinge of mental health issue, it really does exacerbate any little trauma, and it can trigger new ones. So the environmental stimulus is so powerful that people's minds are shaped by it. And when I read a little bit about uh, the PTSD training you've talked about in the past, and how the current drugs that they use and the current therapies, it takes about 4 to 6 weeks to get that brain elasticity to retrain your mind and how to think about all of these things that trigger you into, you know, panic or anxiety or depression or any number of emotional uh, problems. But um, is there a way for us to use this? What is required? I know that it needs a semblance of stability, right? It needs you have to have the background. So what at what stage could this actually be useful to help people who have experienced these traumas in chronic homelessness? Um, how could we use this to bring them back into into culture, right? It's a
Yeah.
cultural shift that happens. You have to adapt to a sense of survival, and getting people to come back to the idea of having a job and supporting the
Right.
the rent, right? You have to be able to earn income, and that takes a level of sobriety, um, or clear thinking, and
Yeah.
to get there, um, it seems like we need a lot of help for our people on the ground, the caseworkers that are doing this work. So the collaboration with your industry seems like an amazing potential worth exploring. Um, but so to get to that point, how do we get to the point where a person is stable enough to take on this kind of therapy?
Right. Yeah. The old Maslow's hierarchy of needs, shelter, food, water, obviously needs to be squared away and stable. And people that have a lot of trauma, you sort of have to come apart a bit before you come back together. So there needs to be some community. I see a huge potential for group work in psychedelic assisted therapy. The group becomes so much of the container to help people lean on each other when they're going through this difficult times. And these aren't miracle cures. If you have a ton of trauma, and especially if it's early childhood stuff, it's going to take potentially several years of work and many treatments, not just one and done, right? And so having centers where people can get their trauma addressed in the container and build community at the same time, I think shows tremendous potential and hope, and also makes it so much more affordable. Currently, we're doing 2 therapists and 1 person in these clinical trials, and that's incredibly expensive and resource intensive.
Right. That
And
that
yeah, go
actually
ahead.
gets to another point is
Yeah.
this going to be available to just the rich, or is this going to be available to people who are, I mean, how does this get covered by an insurance that is available for homeless people or people experiencing crisis, social, economic, whatever kind of crisis that might impact or put them at risk for housing loss?
Yeah, so let's start at the insurance piece. We need billing codes in our field that will allow us to bill for the time. Right now, I can see 1 person for an hour, basically, and then, but MDMA, for example, takes 6 hours or more in a session. So then people would be paying out of pocket. So this just leaves it for the rich at this time, really, or the lucky few that can get access to this. Um, And so we need these billing codes. We need insurances to agree to cover these things. And I think they will, to be honest, because it can be so much faster than one-on-one hour once a week type of therapy, which is totally inadequate for the needs of a lot of folks that are probably coming out of homelessness situations. They're going to need a lot more help than that model.
Right. Yeah, we discussed earlier about the notion of ego expansion, and maybe you can go into that a little bit, because
Okay. This ties in, yeah.
it feels like this is an important part of that, because when you lose at capitalism and you lose your housing, that's like that maximizes your problems.
Well, let me explain what ego expansion is, because it's actually the other side of the ledger here.
Okay.
Ego expansion is sort of we're talking about only the privilege getting access to it, and this is sort of one of the dark sides of psychedelics, especially in our individualistic culture, is that people that go in that have this experience, this profound spiritual experience, oftentimes, and they see God, and they think they've understood the makings of the fabric of the universe. They come back, and now their narcissism is expanded even more.
Oh.
And so this is one of these these are one of these huge dangers that's not often talked about in psychedelic assisted therapy. It doesn't just make people more kind and gentle. It creates, it's a non-specific amplifier of change. And so the directionality of that change, we have to be very careful, considering the context of our culture and its propensity towards grandiosity and egocentrism. Okay, so you're talking about helping people feel less demoralized. It can also do that.
Okay.
Which would be awesome. It can help people feel like they're not alone and they're connected to something greater than themselves. And that spiritual piece is highly correlated with better success with psychedelics. So people aren't just depressed, they're spiritually depressed oftentimes. They feel like there's no one out there for them, because they've been so marginalized and so pushed aside by our culture, that I think the psychedelics can have huge impacts on that spiritual depression that I think comes with it, because I think it's way deeper than mental health.
It's almost a parallel of God, in church, providing that same feeling.
Yes. Yeah.
Oh, fascinating. Okay. Well, let's see. Are there situations where we should avoid this type of therapy? I mean, when you look into the homelessness situation, I mean, there can be the antidepressive effects of this type of treatment, but is this something that has the potential to enable people to stabilize? And really, should we really dig into this? And is it done?
Yeah, there's of course upstream, where we create healthier people that have less trauma that they're carrying around in their lives. And the upstream is huge. And ultimately, we need to be focusing upstream, obviously. And you've heard of the ACE, Adverse Childhood Experience test. You take it and you check these boxes and you add up your total score. And your ACE score really is highly correlated with how you're going to do in life, essentially. It's how much stuff you've had to go through in your life that's been traumatic. And so helping people deal with all those ACE score marks up front is profoundly important. But then on the backside, when people have already been through these horrible traumas and the challenges of homelessness, we're going to be able to help them get their trauma in check and addictions in check. I mean, these substances don't only just help trauma, but they help with addictions. Horrible addictions. And I think ibogaine can be up to 70% effective with opioid addiction, and people don't experience withdrawals. That's from the iboga plant. What's that?
It's a natural. Is it a psychedelic, or is it?
It's a psychedelic, and it's one of the most powerful psychedelics around. It's like a 72-hour long experience. You need lots of medical care because it can be hard on your heart. and they're studying it now in lots of different places. But yeah, it's actually from Gabon is where the root is, which is just south of Cameroon. It's a country below Cameroon. And so the folks in Gabon have been utilizing this medicine for many, I don't know how long, but thousands of years. Yeah.
Wow. Wow. Fascinating. Okay. So there's a lot of different possibilities out there that we need to be studying, and a lot of different places where people are experiencing crises. One of the places that I mean, in my mind, we criminalize a lot of things that could be treated, and people end up in prison when potentially all they're getting from prison is making it worse, as opposed to taking that step where you're addressing crisis at right at the emergency response level, where if you can catch people early enough, like you say, go upstream, and you give those people the ability to connect you to this, lots of all these different treatments that are out there and that might suit your particular trauma crisis, then we can start preventing some of the housing loss. And, to me, that seems like the only way to end homelessness is we have this interesting cycle where we rehouse people here in King County in about a year. But when we rehouse them, there's 2 people waiting, and we have to slow the inflow. And that, like Joe Biden said, turn off the faucet, right? It feels like we need to empower the police with tools that might actually be able to address the crisis, and give them the resources that exist already. Now, this is new. This is something that would go under behavioral health and would be administered by, potentially for rehabilitation clinics. But one of the things I was really interested in was prisons. When a person goes to prison, there's not a lot of benefit to that person. We're removing them. It's like sweeps. We can remove them, but if you don't give them housing, if you don't give them stability, if you don't create and empower, the income and the services that they need to maintain the stable housing, then we're not going to get rid of this homelessness crisis will continue and grow. And it grew about 10% last year, even though we're building as fast as we can. We've maxed out our budget, right? It's a problem that we just can't seem to get ahead of. So when you have the police with the tools of all these different types of behavioral services, and you can start connecting people before the trauma really, really engages some of these mental triggers, that's where I really want to know, how stable does a person have to be to go through these? Do they need stable housing? Do they need you were talking about community before? At what point could we actually start implementing treatments like this?
For sure, stable housing and community. And then you could consider implementing it. Prior to that, I think it would be it would be ill-advised. It would be very problematic. It'd be very destabilizing. And as you talk about the police, I don't know if you mind if I diverge a little bit here, but
sure.
Police. You want to talk about trauma? Police carry a lot of trauma from their work, and in one of the trainings that I went through, we were talking about the military, but it's the same kind of deal. One of the people in my class asked the presenter about, like, what if we treat the trauma of a soldier and you put him back into war? Is that cruel? Is that they're now more open and vulnerable psychologically? And their response to that was, we don't know for sure, but I suspect they would actually have more discernment on when they pulled the trigger, and they would have more compassion and they would operate from a more grounded place in battle, right? And policing in a lot of ways is like war. It's their cops are often very frightened and somewhat traumatized. And so imagine supporting police and their trauma, and so they can deliver care that's more compassionate and more grounded, with the help of mental health providers, which I think they're doing in Bellevue. They're like combining them. There's these new police that are mental health people that are helping the mental health aspects of things, because the police, they've kind of got a different purview.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I love that. I love that tangent. It's important too, because they bring their trauma with them to every interaction.
Yeah.
And so when they, 20% of the this is an old stat, but a couple of years ago, 20% of the Seattle police budget went toward dealing with homeless people, right?
Yeah.
People without housing, right? And it's funny, the difference between that people first, people without housing, as opposed to homeless people. It's a funny way to phrase it, but when you put the people first, it's kind of the reminder that they are people.
Yeah, the language matters.
Yeah, I think sometimes we forget that. And so, when I first started investigating this industry, it was homeless people. Now I am so rightly corrected all the time. It is fantastic, and people first is crucial. So I'm proud of myself here.
Thank you. You're going to help me get my language updated too.
Yeah, right. Yes. So people experiencing housing instability who have not lost their housing yet, if we were to get them stable housing immediately, whatever it takes, whatever the resources are required, we just stabilize them.
Yeah.
Whether it's a utility bill, United Way said that's the most common. Whatever it is that they need to stabilize. Employment oftentimes is one of the drivers of housing loss. We get them employed, or we start digging into why they can't hold a job. And oftentimes it is some trauma that they're holding on to that they're bringing into every conversation, and it's sabotaging their success. So I find a lot of potential. I see a lot of potential in what you're doing to get those traumas out of the way, resolved. If not resolved, at least understood.
Yes.
And once you begin to understand it, then you can start to forgive, and then it becomes something tangible that you can actually put aside for the moment and do what you need to do for employment. Do what you need to do for stable housing, and actually allow a community to be trusted. And I think
people want to be productive.
Yeah.
You take all the barriers internally out of a person's way, and people want to be productive. Yes.
Yeah.
It's the natural order of the human experience to go forth and generate and be creative and make things happen.
Yeah. We're an industrious species for sure.
Yeah.
It's to say the least. Well, in the process of going through all of this, what kind of time frame are we talking about here? Is this something that's going to be happening within the year, or you said you have 1,500 people training to do this? What kind of time frames are we looking at?
Well, MDMA is, I believe, August 11th is the last day the FDA has to make a ruling. So they'll make a decision August 11th, or maybe it's the 12th. 11th is a Sunday, and that will be, then they'll decide this is safe and effective, and we'll schedule it, so therefore it can be prescribed, or they won't. We need more research, but it's likely that it will be scheduled and able to be prescribed. Now, the people that did all the work to get this scheduled, also known as MAPS, the Multidisciplinary Association of Psychedelic Studies, I believe it is what MAPS stands for. Now known as Lycos, I believe they changed their name. But anyways, they are actually now realizing, oh my gosh, we got to pump the brakes a little bit here, because there's a lot of challenges rolling something this powerful out into the world. I believe they're setting up different psychedelic treatment centers where they're going to be making sure that this is done well and correctly around the country. And then they'll slowly start letting it out more and more into the sort of general public for use by other entities and agencies and things of that nature. So it's coming quick. And then we've got psilocybin, probably a couple years until that one's going to be legalized. LSD is getting studied, ibogaine is getting studied, all this stuff. So, over the next 20 years, realistically, we'll see various substances most likely legalized, us learning how to use them well, institutions being built, ground rules being laid. Do we do the decrim model? Do we do the more top-down regulatory model? All to be figured out.
Yeah. It seems like the marijuana industry had a great plan by letting it be medically legal first, getting it to a point where it was understood, and we had enough subjects that we could actually say definitively that, okay, no one has died from a pot overdose. Perfect. Right. Yeah. Right. That is perfect. I love
medically these psychedelics tend to be incredibly safe. Like there's no known overdose for psilocybin, for example, or LSD. MDMA, you got to watch out. It is an amphetamine, and it does have a potential for abuse. But generally speaking, they're pretty darn safe. So hopefully, that we follow suit with the marijuana industry.
Well, thank you so much, Joe. We've been we ran out of time, so I'll just say real quick, next week on Seeking Change, we will discuss the intricacies and ambiguities of housing first with Mike Mathias, director of Anything Helps, to explore best practices for stabilization. And then for radio, for the Rainier Avenue Radio, we have Earth Deserves More Than a Day is currently in session every day this week with special environmental programming until Friday between 10 a.m. and 5 p.m. All right, that's it for us. Thanks again for listening.